Hello, everybody. My name is Marshall Poe, and I will be the moderator of this terrific event, which is 500 years after the fall of the Aztec Empire. I'm not sure what that is, but we'll get rid of it. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'm the editor and founder of the New Books Network. Some of you may have heard about the New Books Network. It's a set of podcasts where we interview people who've written academic books largely. And I also host a podcast for Oxford University Press, and it is in fact Oxford University Press that is bringing you this wonderful event today. You can find all that on the New Books Network. And I'd like to jump right into it by introducing the three experts. I am not an expert on the Spanish Empire or the Aztecs, but I will serve as moderator. Today we have Matthew Restall, Camilla Townsend, and Stefan Rinke on the show. Matthew, maybe you could begin by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your work. Matthew? Was
that me you asked?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can eliminate the echo.
If you turn down your monitor a little bit, that'll probably do it.
So I'm Matthew Restall, and I'm here because of my book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, which was originally published in 2003, but just a few months ago, an updated edition was published with a new essay at the end of it. And the other book that may come up in our discussion is a book that came out in 2018 in English, 2019 in Spanish, called When Montezuma Met Cortez: The True History of the True Story of the Meeting That Changed History. So thank you.
Certainly. Camilla, would you like to go next?
Sure. I teach history at Rutgers University in New Jersey, near New York. And I am here because I recently published a book called Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. I've published on the Aztecs before, but this is the first big or sweeping book that I have published on the subject. And we will talk more about what's in there. I have studied Nahuatl, the Aztec language, for many years now.
Thank you very much. Stefan, you're next. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you, Marshall. Yes, I'm Stefan Rinke. I teach Latin American history at the Freie Universität Berlin, Free University of Berlin, where I'm also a chair of the Department of History. And I have recently published, actually 2 years ago, the German edition of my book, Conquistadors and Aztecs, which will come out next year, a little belatedly, in the English version, but the Spanish version has been on the market quite a while now. So colleagues from Mexico and Spain might have already read it. And of course, I'm looking forward to the English publication too.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Let me begin with this, a very general comment and question. I know that when I was in graduate school, I think that we read something about the Spanish conquest. I don't know if conquest is even the right word anymore, of the Aztecs. And what I remember is that Cortez came and he saw and he conquered. And I don't really remember very much else, but there's a question that lies behind that. What were the Spanish doing in Mexico at that time? And what brought them across the Atlantic to Hispaniola and Cuba, and then later to Mexico? Who would like to take a crack at that one? I mean, why go west instead of east, for example? I'm going to tell Camilla to answer that one.
Well, all right. Yes, thank you. I think we'd all appreciate it if you called on us at random.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you did not tell us that you were going to go right to the heart of world history at this moment. But I think it's a good idea to begin there. Okay. They were, of course, going to go west in order to go east so that they could circumvent the very powerful Muslim bloc, if you will, Muslim world that existed. Everybody wanted to trade with East Asia and South Asia. And they were tired of depending on Muslim middlemen, Middle Eastern middlemen. Okay? Now, there is some debate among scholars as to how much was suspected. That is, it's been assumed until quite recently that it was complete accident that they stumbled across a whole new hemisphere full of lambs. Okay, although Nicolas Way Gomez and others have argued quite successfully that they had theories, okay, and that although they didn't expect a whole new continent to appear, that they did, in fact, had begun to suspect that the classical authors they'd been depending on were quite wrong, that there was going to be a mirror image of the northern world in the south, the way Africa was supposed to be the mirror image of Europe. So they began to expect to find some sort of a southern Asia that would make them rich. Okay, so if you look at the orders that were given to Columbus, okay, it does actually say to trade and to conquer. So there were seeds of the idea of conquest from the beginning. Now, of course, when they did discover this world, and the Spaniards set up shop in the Caribbean, and from there they sent out dozens and dozens of other expeditions. Among them, eventually, Hernando Cortez's ultimately successful expedition against what became the expedition against the Aztecs. But at the time, it was one of many possible unfolding worlds. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else, Matthew or Stefan, do you want to chime in on why they went west instead of east and what they were looking for?
Matthew, you want to go first?
I'll jump in. I couldn't catch everything that Camilla said because I'm battling against an echo, and I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of that. But I think something that she did not just talk about in any detail was the history of slave raiding.
I did not.
Yeah,
right.
Okay, good.
Good. Right, okay.
Yeah, because that's a kind of a short-term response to the question as opposed to explaining and talking about the larger issues. But for those individuals involved, I think that helps to explain what's going on. As those slaving expeditions are fanning out to islands that are further north and south, and then west, because east it's just the Atlantic Ocean. And not only the islands, but the Circum-Caribbean, looking for more populations that can be raided for slaves. And then when they see evidence of Maya cities on the coast of Yucatan, that sort of changes the dynamic of what they're looking for.
So they had already been going, that is, the Portuguese and the Spanish had already been going south to West Africa. They'd already had some success there. Essentially the slave trade had already was set up. It was already a going concern. Is that right? By the time that they made it to the Caribbean.
Of course, not the slave trade that you might think of in the
right, not the transatlantic slave trade,
centuries of the 16th and 17th, and especially the 18th century. But of course, yeah, there was this interest in slave raiding. And an additional point we might make, which might have stirred up the interest of Europeans in going west, were the medieval myths that were circulating quite frequently and all over Europe about lost islands in the Atlantic and so on. So I just wanted to make the point that Camilla made. Just wanted to emphasize that there was also in the theological realm, but also in the sagas of the northern people, some knowledge that was floating around and that gave a basis for this interest in the West. And then, of course, as Camilla already mentioned, the fall of Constantinople, this other fall of the big city, of the big empire. We've just started looking at this from a comparative angle, looking at the fall of Tenochtitlan, which we are going to talk more about today, I guess, and the one of Constantinople, two really path-breaking experiences in the beginning of our modern times.
Yeah, part of my reason for beginning at the world historical level was self-serving. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the fall of Constantinople, which in the Russian experience was, of course, an enormous event. But I think, that, again, what I learned in textbooks was that this essentially cut off the Eastern trade. That the Silk Road had been severed. I don't know if that's true or not, but this forced them to look west. And then in addition, they had this experience with slave raiding on the west coast of Africa. And so they thought, well, let's continue westward and see what we can find. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. Okay. So when they got to the Caribbean, we'll get to Mexico in just a second. What did they find?
Who wants
Go ahead,
to go
Camilla.
first? Camilla.
Shall I begin?
Yeah.
Well, the people who lived in the Caribbean were very different from the people we now call the Aztecs, because they were sedentary, but had not been sedentary farming peoples for nearly as long. It is thought, well, it is known by archaeologists that they came from South America via boats, via canoes, in various waves, two primary waves. And some of them had been there for centuries and were doing some farming, but not nearly to the extent that the Aztecs were. So these were people, the people of the Caribbean, whom the Spaniards were able to conquer, I think I can fairly say, quite easily. I mean, any conquest of other humans who fight back is, of course, difficult and fraught. But it was disastrous. It's fair to say disastrous for the Caribbean peoples. Okay? And the Aztecs will be in a position to put up more of a fight. Okay? So the meeting of the Europeans with the Aztecs really will constitute a different moment. Okay?
Stefan, do you want to add to that, or shall we go to Mexico?
Yeah. I mean, one might also say that, of course, after a couple of years or a couple of decades that the events in the Caribbean had taken place, the Caribbean was pretty much devastated. So there was not much to get out of the Caribbean any longer. So I guess there was also this hope, this expectation that there must be something more. And of course, they had never forgotten the original plan, as Camilla had already stated, of going east, of finding Zipangu, of finding all these promising islands of the East Indies and of the spices that they were looking for, and of the gold, obviously. Oh, now Marshall is frozen too. I guess we have major problems, Camilla.
Oh dear, how dreadful.
Should we go on now?
Right. Yeah, so we have lost poor Matthew, and Marshall is frozen.
Yes.
Goodness, perhaps we should take the event onward to Mexico.
Camilla, what happened then? What happened next? Why would they go to Mexico all of a sudden?
Well, as you were just saying, they here, I think Marshall is returning.
Am I back?
You are back.
Good.
Yes.
Well, Stefan did such a great job. I'm going to turn it over to him. Yeah, that was exactly my question. So they've been in the Caribbean for almost 30 years. They arrived in 1492. And then in 1519, all of a sudden they're across the Gulf of Mexico and they're in Yucatan.
Except it wasn't all of a sudden. They
had 30 years.
Dozens of expeditions, and a number of them had gone up, up and down the coast, north and south, all along the coast of Central America. These two expeditions had already rounded the Yucatan and gone further towards central Mexico. So they did not yet, the Spaniards did not yet have a complete vision, but they were beginning to get a sense of the lay of the land. Okay? And because of those two expeditions that had touched on the Yucatan and gone around the Yucatan, they did have a sense already that there was some sort of an empire, some sort of a great city or set of cities off a little further to the west. They referred to this only as Tierra Firme, the mainland, but they did have a sense that there was something there that was going to be, quote, worth conquering. Okay? So it was purposeful. Okay?
And they spoke in those terms, worth conquering.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
These were expeditions that were likely to be fruitful. Okay, right.
But didn't they? I mean, again, this is part of the textbook version, but I remember this somehow from Columbus's letters or something about spreading Christianity. That this was is that just not true, or
Well,
were they?
no.
Are they just totally hypocritical, or?
Yeah, they did. I mean, they mention it all the time, and
They do.
from their own letters, of course, they portray themselves as being very pious people, praying a lot, holding mass, exactly in the moment after having conquered a city and having murdered thousands and thousands of people, but then they would have a mass and all be very pious again. Of course, I mean, from today's point of view, it's easy to laugh about that and to push it away and say that was only rhetoric. But I think, I mean, you're an early modernist too, and you know how people in that period were really having this faith in their blood and in all they did. So after murdering somebody or after killing somebody, they would have to do repentance, of course. And so this is also an inner urge to do that. And of course, in dealings with the crown back in Spain, it was so important to keep up the argument that they were not just out there for looting and basically what they were a band of gangsters, one would say today, because they were not official soldiers. That did not even have an official contract. But they would go there, and then later they would say, of course, we did it all for the greater good of the king, and also for spreading the faith. So, although for us today it seems pretty much like an invented argument to legitimize the robbery, from the point of view of the contemporaries, I would argue that there was more to that idea of Christianization and of mission than we might think.
I'm sure you are right. I do believe you, Stefan. On the other hand, they were interested in following these religious principles largely only when and where there were large numbers of sedentary people with wealth, with jewels and gold. So they were interested in pursuing these rumors of great cities. They were not so interested in pursuing, say, the coast of Florida. That came later when other places had been explored. And why was that? Because there were no rumors of great and powerful and wealthy civilization. So I think you're right. They meant it, but perhaps unconsciously they happened to follow this religious zeal only where it was also going to make them rich, okay? Or they had reason to.
That's a good point. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Okay. Marshall, are you there, or have we lost? I think we may have lost.
I think he's frozen again.
Frozen again. Okay,
Yes.
Stefan's.
Oh no!
Am I back?
You are back.
Okay, good. So
Okay.
I'm going to ask a question really quick. So let's talk about the first encounter. What did the Spaniards think of the Aztecs, and what did the Aztecs
think of the Spaniards?
Right.
Think of the Spaniards.
This is a good one for Matthew, who has written.
Yeah, Matthew, go ahead.
Beautifully on this. Okay.
Oh yeah, thanks for punting
Okay.
that to me. It's like an impossible question to answer, really. It's
Right.
what do we know what they were really thinking? And I think actually this is a kind of a squirrely way of answering it, but I was just having this thought when I was listening to what Camilla and Stefan were saying and trying to kind of pick up the thread of that. Each individual is going to think something slightly different. And that's what we assume in our own society, right? As we're constantly trying to understand like demographic groups and why people, vote this way or don't and so on. And I think we have to accept that the Aztecs and the Spaniards were the same. They had their own kind of ways of thinking and their own kind of degree to which they were very cynical about religious motives or genuine believers or whatever it is. So I think we want to always keep that in mind as an important factor right before we start wading into making big blanket statements about Spaniards and Aztecs. But having said that, and I've got my caveat there, I can jump in and make big blanket statements. I often have a discussion either in the classroom or when talking about this with say professional journalists, who are extremely well read and so on, but they don't spend their whole lives buried in the Aztecs and the Conquistadors like we do. And they say, is this equivalent to when we eventually fly out in space and encounter aliens, or when aliens come to the planet Earth, right? So on the one hand, I like kind of the enormity of it, the idea that this is something so massive as an encounter that it is equivalent to humanity encountering some other unknown species from another planet. But it gets really problematic really quickly because these are people. And the Spaniards saw the Aztecs as people, and the Aztecs saw the Spaniards as people. And the idea that the Aztecs saw the Spaniards as gods, or that when they saw a horse with a rider on, they thought it was, a centaur, like a single creature and so on, that's complete nonsense. That tells us a lot about the Spanish mindset in imagining what the Aztecs thought. And there's a lot of sort of cultural context in medieval Europe that makes that make sense. That we should actually expect that the Spaniards will go, "Ooh, I wonder if these Indians think we're gods. I bet they do." That is exactly what we would expect that they would think, right? Because other Europeans did as well. That's what the English did wherever they went. Like, oh, look, natives, I bet they think we're gods. Don't you think so, Charles? Absolutely. I mean, that's what we would expect. And it's important to kind of to decode that and imagine that, no, the Aztecs like, oh, okay. Yeah, they have big beards. They smell pretty bad. They have really interesting technology with them. But they're just people from somewhere else. It's not that kind of earth-shattering. Now, what do we do with these people? And then that's I think the next question that's really interesting. Stefan, you look like you were dying.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in one point because I think, of course, basically I agree, but I think one point which is not really taken into consideration is the early modern mindset, also in Europe and not only in Aztec Mexico. This idea that the heavenly sphere, can I say that the godly sphere is able to interfere in the earthly affairs all the time. Of course, we call that, what's the word in English? Aberglauben, this idea of having witches and sorcerers and so on. And but that was something that, of course, the Spanish conquistadors took with them all the time, and you can read it in their sources when they tell about all these miracles going on during the battles. And so I do think that both sides, while not believing, of course, this master narrative of the big god coming back, they obviously, I wouldn't throw that away all of a sudden, but rather think that there was some belief that there might be happening something here, which is, as you so well stated, which is outside the sphere of our common experience, and that might be some miracle making going on. And of course, we know in the Aztec world that gods could always play tricks on people. They could do good things and they could also do bad things, and they did that all the time. So why not have the gods take the body of these Europeans and put on some beards and then play a trick on them? But that of course was only for a short time. It's not permanent. So of course I absolutely agree that they would not have taken these human beings as anything other than human beings, but for a time perhaps personified or taken in by some ghostly spirits or some magic that was going on.
I think I have a story that might illustrate both men's points. That is Matthew's original point that we have to assume there was variability and disagreement within each community, and Stefan's point that we must take seriously any sense of wonder. But also then I would like to keep alive the possibility that they were also being irreverent and snarky. The indigenous as much as the Europeans. So this is a story that comes not from Mexico, but from the Andes. Guaman Poma de Ayala, some of you will know the text. Now, he was not there, but he's describing, though, things that he has heard from his mother's family. She was an Inca, okay? And that at the early encounter, a number of women were given, as they always were, to the Spaniards for sex and to cook, etc. And in the ensuing days, some of the Inca men asked them, so, tell us more about these guys, these new arrivals. And they said, clearly, very irreverently, that becomes clear by the end of the story, Oh, yes. Those swords that you've seen, those things that hang down, that's actually their male member, So they were, now, some historians have looked at that and said, oh my, they really did believe these men were gods, apparently, apparently forgetting or overlooking that these women had already been given to the Spaniards and knew very well that the swords were not their male member. In any event, the Inca, I forget if it was the general or the Inca himself, got so mad that they were being irreverent, that at least so says Guaman Poma, he had the young women killed, for making snarky jokes at a time like this, when something serious, and perhaps to use your word, Stefan, perhaps something miraculous or strange or dangerous was going on. Now, that doesn't come from Mexico, and we're here to discuss Mexico, but it seems to me sort of the perfect story to illustrate all the various points that you two just made.
I think it was George Orwell who said that imperialism was simply an effort to keep the natives from making fun of the imperialists. But you have to imagine they did.
Right.
Look at these idiots wandering around. Like, what? Why don't they go home? I don't mean to make light of imperialism by any means.
Well, these young Inca girls did.
Yeah, like, who are these idiots? Smelly idiots with the beard. So let's talk a little bit about sources. And I really, again, Matthew says this is an impossible question. All of the best questions are. But is there anything we can say about this first encounter from the sources? I'm interested, especially in the Aztec sources, because I know nothing about them. The Spaniards were rather graphomaniacal. They wrote a lot. I don't know about the Aztecs. What kind of sources do we have? And I guess Camilla's the right person to answer this question.
I'm happy to begin, although in fact Matthew is probably the best essay.
Okay,
on this, we don't have sources written by indigenous people in the years of the conquest. We have the only sources on any side that survive from 1519 to 1521 are Cortez's letters. But we do have indigenous people who spoke about it years later, some of whom had actually been there and some of whom who had known people who were there. That this was in the beginning in the 1550s that some of this started to get written down. And interestingly, much of what they say matches quite well with what the Spanish sources say. And they are different in certain particulars, absolutely. But we do, from both sides, get the same sense of the meeting between Montezuma and Cortez. Now, I think, Matthew, that essay you had at the end of the Seven Myths book is very good on sort of what do we make of these sources about the meeting, given that they were, other than Cortez's description, they were all written years later. You do a very good job, I think, of not exactly decoding, but because we can't be sure, but breaking down the possible meaning. So when indigenous people run to prevent the Spaniards from touching Montezuma, and both sides mention this, it's pretty good evidence that they really believe nobody should touch their kings. And I believe, my memory anyway, is, Matthew, that you break down these sources very, very well in that essay at the end of.
Yeah, Matthew, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I think if you are trying to explain to a room of people who are not historians why we think that what we do is kind of tricky, and they say, but aren't you just reading old books and then kind of rewriting them, like Prescott did with Bernal Diaz, and then we say, oh no, because you never really know what's in the text and so on. And so then if we start using sort of I guess language that's a little bit out of date now, like the language of postmodernism, that doesn't explain it either, right? And they go, so really what you're saying is there are no facts and there's no truth and blah blah blah. I'm like, well, no. Let's explain it best by being specific. And this particular piece of history, right, the so-called conquest of Mexico, is a great example because all the sources are tricky. And they're all tricky because the Spanish side of things, all of those sources are all either they get very late and therefore are completely dependent on the earlier sources. And the ones that are early enough, so let's just say 16th century, are all written for particular purposes. And you have to kind of spend a lot of time to understand who these characters are and what their particular purpose is. And why they are writing that in order to, and that's all before you even get into kind of issues of reliability and veracity and so on. And then the Aztec sources, it's very tempting to go, oh, wow, that was kind of exhausting dealing with the Spaniards, but now we have to return to the banquet. Look, there's a poem that tells us, and it talks of suffering and so on, so that has to be, let's just put that in and let's just say that's how they felt about it. But the fact is that the Aztec sources, or let's just say the indigenous sources, probably be more accurate, are even more tricky because it's the same the same method that we applied to Spanish, we have to apply to them. Why are they writing this? What's the purpose? Often authorship is less clear than it is with Spanish sources. They're just in Nahuatl, but we don't actually know specifically who wrote them and how it came to be. And then there's the filter of, ironically, colonialism and Christianity. And so we're trying to figure out what happened sort of when everybody met. And instead, we're dealing with all the filters that have been created as a result of that meeting, right? So then kind of trying to decode and, I think it was, do you remember, Camilla, what it was that Jim Lockhart used to say about, he had some kind of humorous comment about the shortcuts that historians take. I can't remember.
There's the law of the preservation of energy of historians. He used to talk about that,
that's
right? That we always use the easy sources first, like the
Right.
laws. What was the law? That must have been what it was, and then only gradually realize that's probably not how things were. They made a law about it, and then only little by little move outward to sources that are harder to find or harder to understand. And by the time you get to indigenous sources written decades later, you're really sort of proving, and given that it took us as a field so long to get there, you're really proving the law of the preservation of the energy of history.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that a lot when I was sitting there, and there's like Cortez's letters in English. Thank you, Pagden. There's like Bernal Diaz in multiple things, but I mean the Penguin editions, which you see in used bookstores everywhere, and it's so easy. And then you go to something like Ixtlilxochitl, which is just a source that is not readily available, is often dismissed, and so on. And you actually read that account of the battles and so on. I think there's more there that gets us closer to the reality than there is in any of Cortez's letters or anything by Bernal Diaz, and certainly Lope de Gomara, which is basically what Bernal Diaz just copied from. So, but it's harder to read. It was written in Nahuatl. It was written it was written a little bit later, and obviously, it isn't any more than the Spanish sources, just a kind of reliable eyewitness account. What those of us who are in the business will kind of roll our eyes when we see that, a good Bernal Diaz, a good soldier, and his eyewitness account, and like he's turned into like the pilgrim from Bunyan or something like that. There's clearly some kind of cultural reference. Probably one of the characters in the Star Wars movies, right?
Stefan, did you want to talk a little bit about the sources?
Say something?
Yes.
I was just wondering, of course, you're so right. And now I'm at the moment editing the Codex Mendoza, and we are in the process of exactly, with Mexican colleagues from UNAM. We're working on that, and we'll have the book out next month. So we're quite far gone with that project, and it's a wonderful idea because lately the German TV interviewed me a couple of times, and then they came up with, didn't the Aztecs have this wonderful ordered life of the way they would castigate their children if they did bad things and so on, and of course they had that all from the Codex Mendoza. But if you look at the source, of course, you find out that it was written in order to show the king back in Spain that this is an orderly society and you better keep it the way it is, because then we, the elites who are able to write this text, will remain in power, and that is why it was all written. So it's just an example to illustrate what you've just been saying. But then on the other hand, let me also add, looking at it from a broader picture, not only of Latin American history, one could also say, of course, and I wonder if Marshall, as a early modern Russian historian, would agree that the conquest of America, relatively speaking, is one of the best documented events of the 16th century. The number of sources that are out there is simply astonishing. The number of sources, you go to Seville, to the Archivo de Indias, which of course does have all the Spanish version of it, you will find all these lawsuits and all these documents which give you quite a bit of different perspectives on the event. And as historians, of course, you already said that, Matthew, we always can only try to reconstruct something which is our own interpretation, and we do that with any kind of source in the very end. But if we do that for the conquest, in comparison, so to say, for example, to other events of the time, I would say we have more material available and from different perspectives available that we have for other events in the same time period.
I would say that that's true in the Russian context. When Europeans first went to Russia, and this was in the late 15th century, early 16th century, the documentary environment was very poor. And what we can say about what went on in 14th and 15th century Russia is not very much, to be honest with you, just not very much. But let's move on to the conquest itself. And also I want to take a little bit of time for questions at the end. Of course, we have this kind of stereotyped image of Cortez showing up, being thought of as a god, which he wasn't, obviously, or he wasn't even thought of as a god. And then he very quickly defeats the Aztecs. This is not correct, is it? Yeah. So, Camilla, you want to start with that?
I think the three of us would all agree it was really at least 100-year process, the conquest. Okay, there was a war though between 1519 and 1521 that was very important. But the mistake we have often made, I think, in the field is to assume that because the Spaniards won that war, that they instantly dominated all of Mexico, when in fact it took them several more generations. Some would argue that they never really did, in fact, dominate Mexico. I'm not one of them, but there's a case to be made there. Okay? I think most of it, a sort of meeting in the middle position would be that it took them about a century to bring most of the indigenous people to heel, so to speak. Okay? So yes, we really must get past any notion that this. How did you put it? You gave your Julius Caesar quote, like the Bene Vidi Vici, that Julius Caesar came and saw and conquered, right? That we must reject that out of hand. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one way, without going on too long, to think about it is that the Spaniards were not the only people who won that war. That's a good one. And that's where we make the mistake is, look, the Spaniards won August 13th, 1521, and then 3 centuries of New Spain begins. Sure, the Spaniards emerge as victorious on that day, but they're not the only ones. The Tlaxcalans also won, and I would argue that the Texcoco also won. That really the only people who lost, aside from, let's kind of in larger terms, the tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of people who die from disease and battle and are enslaved, right, by August the 13th, 1521. But aside from them, the only people who really lose are the Mexica on the island, because everybody else by that point has more or less shifted to the side of the besiegers. So then the story gets really interesting. After 1521, amongst these different actors who are the victors of the war, how is it that the Spaniards emerge the ultimate victors? And I would say even then their victory never becomes 100%. I don't know. I suppose Camilla and I can go back and forth about it's not 100. What is it? Like how far? The business of establishing a colony it never ends. It goes on for that whole 300 years.
Mm-hmm. Stefan, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really a long-term process, and there are so many autonomous islands that all these maps that we have in mind about, this viceroyalty of New Spain coming into being then, and it's all colorful and all one single landmass, of course, is really not true to reality, but it has been a real, actually a real early modern empire. That's the way early modern empires work. They were quite insular. They had their strongholds here and there, and then in between, people had quite a lot of leeway and could do quite a bit of things autonomously. But in the end, what I would always also say, it lasted 300 years, and that's quite a bit in world history. So they did have something to them which made them stay, and of course they also left so many ingrained problems in Mexican society until this very day, so that they cannot just be argued away. If we talk about the indigenous conquistadors who did it all and did all the victory and had all the victory to them. I would say exactly as Matthew said, they also won. They also won in the short term, but in the long term they lost.
Mm-hmm. I was very interested to talk a little bit about, before we go to the questions, from the perspective of the Aztecs. Certainly the Spanish show up, and that's interesting, but they were an empire among other polities. And so they must have had some sort of, in terms of international relations, if we can speak of a modern term, there were other groups there that they were used to dealing with. Can anybody talk a little bit about that? Do we know anything about that?
Well, I mean, yes, the Aztecs had extensive experience both negotiating with and sometimes conquering people they had been in the midst of negotiating with. Okay. And it seems that at first that is how they perceived the Spaniards too. That is yet another actor that had come along the coast. Later they realized no, across the sea, but at first along the coast, who were to be incorporated into this system. And we have every reason to believe that they did try sending tribute. So they experimented with battles. Seemed like battles were going to be hard to win, but so then they offered tribute, thinking that must be what these people wanted. So they did attempt to incorporate the Spaniards into the sort of international, if I will borrow your word, diplomatic maneuvers that they were accustomed to. But it didn't end up working.
Well, they did have a settled diplomacy because they, when powers for over a long period of time deal with one another, they develop a protocol. And so they tried to use this protocol quite naturally.
Right.
Are these people civilized? Will they respond to a civilized gesture?
Yes,
it turned out they weren't
right.
civilized from the Aztec point of view, but they did try everything that they could.
To a certain degree, they did even. I mean, they accepted the women that they were granted with. That was, of course, a major measure of the Aztecs to establish international relations, giving away female slaves. But of course, afterwards they did not react according to indigenous values.
I will only add that they weren't always slaves. That is, part of this diplomatic sort of protocol had to do with which women you gave and under what conditions. So were they intended to be slaves or were they intended to be a princess who would marry with the enemy? That set up different parameters, different guidelines. And Malinche, the one who translated, was given as a slave. But in Tlaxcala, for example, people who ended up siding with the Spaniards, they offered daughters of the four high kings. They believed to marry with the Spaniards. That did not happen because they did not fully understand what the Spaniards were going to do. But, okay.
Well, I think we should take some time for some of these questions. We have many questions, and I apologize to everybody in the audience. We will not be able to get to them all, obviously, but I will cherry pick them. Here's an interesting one. Terms like empire and conquest, to what extent are they limited by words rooted in European languages and European political experiences? What are there equivalent terms, do we know, of empire and conquest in these Aztec languages? Did they speak in a similar sort of conceptual language?
I would say that their political language was comparable, not exactly parallel. They certainly had words for conquest. In fact, they had multiple words for conquest, having to do with whether these people had been fully destroyed or only partially rendered dependent, etc. The mutual attempts at conquest were a big part of their business in the past. So now, there are other words, though. So the idea of empire, no, I don't. Maybe Matthew will disagree. I don't think there's a Nahuatl word for empire. On the other hand, Hueyialtepet, meaning the greater Altepet, the greater state. They could have an empire in the sense of gluing together, in their sense of it, more smaller political units they called Altepet. So they could manage to convey the idea of an empire by talking about a Hueyialtepet or Anahuac, the lands between the seas, by the seas, conveyed the idea of a place where the Mexica dominated. So they had ways of doing it, even if the language wasn't exactly parallel to the European styles of talking about.
Yeah, this was similar to the Russian experience, because when the Europeans showed up, they used Latin or Polish in this case. And
actually, the
Russians had similar words. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a strong discussion about these concepts now in Mexico, and Andrés López Obrador and Gloria Steinbaum, the mayor of Mexico City, have recently challenged the use of the word conquest for all that had been going on, and they want to replace it with invasion. But of course, that would again be a word with European roots to it, and I'm not quite sure if that would really catch what was going on. But anyway, it shows us that using these words also is a way of establishing a certain interpretation of reality, and so it's important to really think about what these words mean and to put them into question even after 500 years, or perhaps exactly because after 500 years they might have lost some of their explanatory value.
So here's another question about language, and it is this, and this did occur to me. Do you really believe it's correct to use the word Spain instead of something a little bit more specific like Castile and Aragon and so on and so forth? I don't know the answer to this, but you do. So is there a Spain? I mean, this actually comes up in the Russian context too, because the Russians didn't call themselves Russians. They called themselves Muscovites.
Right.
The Europeans called them Russians.
I don't know what you think. I mean, Spain is coming into being, right? And that this history, the experience that Spaniards have in Mexico, is part of that process. It's part of what makes Spain sort of develop or drives that process of the creation of Spain. So I think it's okay as a shorthand, as long as we understand that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and that Spain, as it exists in the 17th century, does not in 1521. And as long as we don't just, it's like conquest and empire, as long as we don't throw the words out as if now they're on the page, we don't have to discuss them anymore. Everybody understands the concept and on we move. That's not the case, I don't think, with any of this.
Would anyone else like to comment on? Here's another interesting question that it had never occurred to me, but I think it's a good one. I tell my students, quote, that without diseases, Mesoamerica would look a lot like South and East Asia today. That is, the Europeans would come, but they would be thrown off after a few centuries, or at least some period of time. Do you agree with that? Do you understand the question? In other words, the question is that the disease actually played an extremely important role, and we can see this comparatively.
I would agree, actually, to a certain degree. I mean, I'm not very good at counterfactual history, but at least the central point that the pandemics of the 16th and early 17th century did play a major role in enabling Europeans to establish what Camilla has just described. You know, this colonial rule, which took so long, and in that process, pandemics was absolutely decisive. But if whether Mexicans or the many people, indigenous people of the region, would have thrown out the Europeans after a while, I rather doubt that, because as we see in the middle of the 18th century, the demographic development is turning around, and the indigenous peoples are thriving, they are growing, and they are not dying off as some Europeans had pretended before, but they are still there, and they are alive and kicking, and very much and very active. But of course, what does happen, and what is a major difference to the later colonial period, is that the process of mestizaje, the process of the mingling of different ethnic groups in the Americas. And that makes Latin America also so unique in world history. It's a laboratory for what we're going on, what we're going through now these days. You know, of course, you Americans have your share of experience in that for quite a while, but we Europeans are new to that. And so I really think that looking at Latin America from that point of view can teach us a lot of lessons.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? I found it very interesting, though.
It's a good counterfactual. I think the counterfactuals can be useful, as long as we don't think, oh, well, we know what would happen or would happen. It helps us to realize that the things that did happen aren't necessarily inevitable.
Yeah, here's
an element. unpredictability. Yeah.
So here's a question. We sort of touched on this earlier, and that is it appropriate to talk about the conquest of the Aztecs when in fact several different sorts of political entities were conquered, or some of them weren't conquered and were made allies?
That's a tough one. And I guess actually Matthew has played with the possibility of renaming the war, and there are various ways to try to deal with that fact. It does remain the case, though, that and Stefan alluded to this earlier, the Spaniards ended up as the senior partners, shall we say. They ended up on top as the preeminent tax collectors, if you will. And so it behooves us to bear that in mind. Okay? Likewise, the Aztecs were the leaders before, and so when they lost, to use political or European terminology, when the Europeans would have beheaded that state by removing the Aztecs and then assumed the governance of it, that does mean something. That is significant. So I am comfortable with talking about the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. Okay, as long as, and this is what Matthew was just saying, as long as we don't say that unselfconsciously, uncritically, and without explaining what we mean and all the ways in which those are not quite the right terms. Okay. I don't know, Matthew, do you want to talk more about talking about it as a Spanish-American?
Well, no, I think the reason it's okay to say that about the Aztecs is because the Aztec is not the same thing as indigenous Mexicans,
right,
or Nahuas, or all the people there. And they didn't even use the term Aztec anyway at themselves, right? So it's a word that we use to describe that political arrangement. I know some people, there was a fashion for calling it the Triple Alliance, which is a valid phrase. I don't think it's better than Aztec Empire, but perfectly valid. And all of these things all help us to better kind of think about and discuss and understand what that arrangement was. So the Aztec Empire, if we accept that phrase, does cease to exist, this month, 500 years ago, but the empire doesn't cease to exist. The Aztec part then has to be removed. And what is it after that? Well, immediately after that, it's unsure, because as we were saying earlier, there were multiple victors. It is going to become, within a generation or two, another empire, which is New Spain. We could call it the New Spain Empire or something like that. I mean, they call it the Kingdom of New Spain, but that's what it is. It's the Aztec Empire kind of preserved and expanded with the same indigenous peoples benefiting from it. But as Camilla said, there's now a new sort of central city state, and I'm kind of wigging my finger in the air because I don't mean in the kind of geographical sense. I mean as in a kind of a meta geographical way, right? Of the Spaniards, they're kind of there and nowhere all at the same time, as sort of the top of that pyramid. So I think sometimes Aztec gets confused and conflated, not in Mexico, but outside Mexico, gets confused and conflated with just Mexico, or all indigenous people of Mexico, or all Mesoamericans sort of north of Guatemala or something like that. And obviously that's not the case. I'm shutting up, Marshall, so you can keep going, because I know we're running out.
Yes, well, I was going to, we're almost out of time. We only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to take a page out of Matthew's book, and I'm going to ask each of you a question and put you on the spot. And Matt wrote about the 7 myths. And one of the people in the chat asked which of the 7 myths is the one that you think really most needs to be corrected. And I guess I'll ask each of you in turn. If you can think of some misconception about the fall of the Aztec Empire, which one would you have us do away with immediately? Like, please just stop with this already. Actually, I'm thinking of this my own. There are lots of, I was going to talk a little bit about Ivan the Terrible and what terrible means and how terrible he was. And I just wish people would stop talking about that. I'm tired of that. Okay, it's not interesting. So why don't we begin with Matthew himself? Which one of these myths is, the one that we really need to do away with?
I like that question, and I think, like all good questions, my answer to it is going to be different week after week, depending on, you come at me in a month and I might have a totally different. Right now, and this has been going on for months now, as a result of all the conversations I've been having about this quincentennial, the one I think is so wrong and it is so deeply rooted is this general impression and understanding of the Aztecs. and who they were, their civilization. And it seems like it doesn't matter how much amazing work is done in Mexico by historians and archaeologists, and then the work that's being done by people outside Mexico as well, to explain how Aztec civilization is not simply about dragging somebody up the steps of the pyramid and cutting their heart out. It somehow, that image just is so huge and looms so large, and everyone says, yeah, okay, fine, I get it. They were great poets and they built this amazing city, and you're trying to convince me that in any kind of objective way, their civilization was no more inferior to that of anybody in Europe, Spaniards, English, French, or whatever. But ultimately, I want to go back and think about what it's like to have your heart cut out while you're lying there and so on. There's this kind of obsession with it, and the more I have thought about it, the more my position has kind of moved to an extreme place, where I just think human sacrifice is a term that carries so much baggage that I used to think there's a little bit colonialist. Now I'm like, this is a totally racist, totally colonialist, imperialist term that does enormous damage to the Aztecs in terms of their reputation, that I think has implications for how indigenous peoples throughout the Americas are seen and treated today. So it's important. It isn't just a kind of an abstract, pedantic, a bunch of historians happily arguing. It matters for the millions of indigenous peoples in the hemisphere today, and how they're treated, and how in some way I think there's a direct line from look at how barbaric the Aztecs were to indigenous people today. Are we going to treat them with full rights and full equality and deal with those issues or not?
It is a powerful trope. I hadn't thought of it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I'm doing this thing that they teach the school children to do now, rather than to talk out of turn. I agree. That is exactly what would have said, except that Matthew said it better. So.
Okay. All right. Stefan, you get the last word then.
Can I add a final point? Yeah, I was actually motivated in writing my book when I heard of the director of the Spanish RTVE tell an audience in Europe in the year 2018 that after all, the Spaniards did bring civilization and good wine and wheat bread and all these, kind of always reminds me of the life of Brian, and when they were asked what the Romans give you, and that's what he actually believed and what he told. And I would really love that no person in some sort of responsibility going on and telling this kind of idiocies any longer. But I would also love to not see any more of some of the reactions that came from Mexico at the same time. We said that the Aztecs were a wonderful civilization, so peaceful, so generous, and so great, and we would love them, and without them the world would be poorer. So I guess what we need is profound historical research, the way that such that is offered by Oxford University Press. And in our 3 books here.
The people,
that's why the 3 of us are here, not because we are the ultimate authorities, but because we just happen to write books.
Yeah, the people at Oxford University Press are very, very happy to conclude this session in this way. I would like to conclude by thanking Matthew and Camilla and Stefan for being with us today. It's been a wonderful discussion. We could go on for another hour. I got tons of more questions. There are a lot of questions. There are 24 of them. I think I got to 3. So we should probably do this again.
Fine
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
So
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Matthew and Camilla. Bye,
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, guys.